You mentioned in one of your last talks that petroleum wasn't what we thought it was, that it wasn't a fossil fuel, that it didn't come from fossil animals.
Yeah.
Is it just a mineral? Is it a mineral like any other mineral? Is that how it, what would you say? How did it, what's the origin of
you see,
petroleum?
when they first found petroleum, because they were beginning to make motors and needed on axles or wheels on railroad trains and all that sort of thing, and remember, trains started in the beginning of the 19th century, then oil went from just a lubricant to a fuel, and it made it valuable. And Rockefeller happened to be the smartest man in the business at the time, but he made most of his money, or much of it, off the transport of the petroleum as well as selling it. But one thing they realized was, because oil is putting a price on oil is like putting a price on a pail of water. You know, there's no initial cost. It's in the ground, and in those days they were, some of it almost what you'd call surface mining the oil. They didn't go down deep. So in order to get the price up, they hit on the idea that they would have to make it appear to be scarce. That boy, after we take the next few barrels out, we're probably going to have to close as well. You know, that kind of thing. Well, a very fortuitous event. In 1892, there was a convention in Geneva of scientists to determine what organic substances are. Well, the definition of organic is a substance with hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. And so it's usually a living substance, a tree. You analyze a dead tree, hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, and grass, and so on, living things. Animals, we are hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. So at this Geneva Convention, Rockefeller took advantage of sending some scientists over who said, oil, petroleum, is hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. Therefore, it must be derived from the spoiling, the rotting of formerly living matter. And playing the game properly, when this scientific convention was over, they defined oil as the residue from formerly living matter. Well, that makes it a fossil fuel. I don't know why they decided to use the word fossil, but it says formerly living matter, it's fossil. Well, of course, today, and another thing we should know is that there has never been a fossil, a real fossil, found below 16,000 feet. And you can't argue at 16,000 as a level line, because someplace the ground sinks and so on. But 16 is what the scientists say, 16,000. We mine oil, or we drill for oil, at 30,000, 33,000, 28,000 every day of the week. So right there we rule it out that it isn't fossil fuel. It's called fossil fuel for the minds of the public to feel that it is an asset that is running out, being depleted. We talk about depletion allowance, which is a lot of, you know. And actually, if you know the world's oil supply, you know that it is not going to run out for an awfully long time. It is the second most prevalent liquid on Earth. And we haven't begun to dig. Well, with all that background, you see, the people in charge of the petroleum business, for perfectly reasonable business things, like any other man in the business, wants to keep his price as high as he can get away with. And the way to do is just say, well, there's no more. The last barrel is going to cost $1,000, and then it's all done. And they preach that stuff. What bothers me is that in geology books, it's in there. The geologists say it's a fossil fuel. Somehow they've been bought. I mean, I went to a 4-year federal staff energy seminar run by the government of the United States during the so-called energy crisis. I was the participant that represented the railroad industry. The airline industry was there. Every AA, administrative assistant of senators and congressmen, was there. The CIA was there, the Defense Department was there, the State Department was there. Sometimes sitting right in front of me in the row would be Henry Kissinger with his friend, the head of Department of Defense, It's too bad I can't put the names with them. But anyway, people like that, top men in the government, sitting there listening to the Federal Staff Energy Seminar. Well, what this was doing is for 4 years, they were teaching a propaganda line to the leading people in this country, and therefore to the leading people in the world, when you include the Kissinger and Schlesinger, among others. And the object of it was, as Kissinger used in his own terms when it was time for him to speak, to create a world price for oil. In other words, not 30 cents a gallon here and 90 cents a gallon there, but let's get a world price. That's their goal, and they're trying to do that for wheat and everything else. We don't realize what the controls are, whether it's oil or some of these other things. Almost everything today is being categorized at the highest price they can possibly make it go. And so calling petroleum a fossil fuel is the basis for this system with respect to petroleum. And I don't know if the name Arthur Kantrowitz rings any bell. Arthur Kantrowitz is the head of the Kantrowitz Labs, set up by the Avco company near Boston, scientific laboratories, and a great man in the scientific world. And Kantrowitz and I were sitting at a table at this seminar once, and the table happened to be all young college grad, PhD geologists. And so just to get a conversation started, I turned to Kantrowitz and I said, Arthur, what do you think about this foolishness of these speakers talking about fossil fuel? And it was kind of put up. He started laughing. He said, you know, that gets me. He says, I don't have a geology degree, but he had 1,000 other degrees. And he said, I don't understand. He said, you'd think that these heads, these other fellows at the table, we did it on purpose, start listening, you know. And he asked, he said, are you gentlemen, he says, you're here at the meeting, are you gentlemen by any chance geologists? And one fellow, yes, I am. And the other one, yeah. He said, well, why don't you tell me? He said, why is oil, you know, and he went on like that. We brought the house down because nobody could argue with Kantrowitz. He like Einstein. People aren't going to, and he told him right there, he said, just drop it. But it's in all the books and in all the papers. But it started from that strange meeting in 1892, a scientific convention. I have a big, thick scientific encyclopedia put out by the Van Oosteren Company that's about 15 years old now, but it has the whole story of the conference. It doesn't have the Rockefeller part, but it has the whole story of how they straightened out organic chemicals and how it was all figured, and they've got petroleum right in there.
Amazing. Amazing. So
these aren't accidental things, you see. There's a dollar sign behind almost everything.
okay.
This is a brief video on the abiogenic theory of the origin of oil and natural gas. In a nutshell, the abiogenic theory is that most oil, petroleum, natural gas, what we often call fossil fuels, are actually derived from primarily methane, which was trapped in the Earth when the planetary nebula condensed. So the mainstream Western theory of the origin of oil and natural gas is that when the nebula formed, it did contain methane, but it became the early Earth and other planets became extremely hot, and the methane burned, essentially oxidized to water and carbon dioxide primarily. And then in turn, that eventually gave us the atmosphere that we have, gave us life, and then living organisms produced oil and natural gas. They were trapped in sedimentary rock and sort of pressure cooked over millions of years into most of the oil and natural gas that we have. That's the source of gasoline, diesel fuel, heating fuel. That's all over the Middle East and Southern California and other places. However, there's been for a long time a theory that in fact the oil and natural gas formed from this methane, which then polymerized into more complex hydrocarbons that make up heavier materials, coal, oil, natural gas, etc. That theory is very closely associated with the late physicist, Thomas Gold. So Thomas Gold died in 2004, but he really championed and popularized this idea in the United States. He was very out of step with sort of the mainstream scientific theory, and late in his life he published a book kind of summarizing his theories about this called The Deep Hot Biosphere, The Myth of Fossil Fuels, which I've read. And he not only postulates that the Earth is full of hydrocarbons from the planetary nebula, not from fossil fuels, but in fact that these are oxidizing within the Earth and produce the heat inside of the Earth. So it's not coming from uranium trapped in the Earth, which is the mainstream theory, but there's actually chemical combustion at a low level going on deep inside the Earth, and that's why the interior of the Earth is hot, and also that in fact living organisms probably originated in this subterranean hydrocarbons that were there from the very beginning of the Earth. And so expects, and indeed we do find bacteria actually living in oil fields and so on. One thing that's important to understand is generally it used to be the case that you would be taught that oil and natural gas came from plants and animals which had been pressure cooked. I remember that in school when I was a kid, but that's clearly false. The oil and natural gas, for the most part, that we find, and there is an exception I'll talk about in a minute, but it is full of chemicals called hoponides that come from bacteria. In fact, there's very little evidence, very little of the chemicals you would expect to see if plants and animals produced oil and natural gas. So the dominant theory today, the mainstream Western theory of the origin of oil and natural gas, is that bacteria, small single-celled organisms, were trapped in sedimentary rock hundreds of millions of years ago, and by some process we can't really duplicate in the lab, pressure cooked into oil and natural gas and coal and so on. The alternative theory has an implication. One of a number of implications of it would be that planets like Mars, the Moon, many bodies in the solar system actually must contain hydrocarbons as well inside of them, and that would naturally lead to the expectation that you'd get methane, which is the main hydrocarbon we're talking about, seeping to the surface of Mars, which of course is something we may be observing. So the Curiosity rover on Mars has been detecting methane intermittently for several years. Just made the news yet again with a particularly high amount of methane. It's not really that much, it's parts per billion, but it was totally unexpected, at least by mainstream scientists. Again, if you believe in the deep hot biosphere and the ideas of Thomas Gold, you would expect to see this. It's likely that this would happen. And Mars would be a very good place to look for this type of methane or verify this theory. Now, there are many other ways that there could be methane on Mars. It could come from, Mars could have supported bacterial life, could still have bacterial life, and that was pressure cooked into methane, or in fact there are living organisms underground, or even some geological processes that have nothing to do with life that might produce methane. But the major point is this theory, which this is a good book on it. This is Thomas Gold's Deep Hot Biosphere, and it's a sort of semi-popular book. It's not very technical. It explains his theory, and he makes a lot of strong arguments in the book that, in fact, most of the oil and natural gas, coal, etc., that we're dealing with on Earth, that we find on Earth, is in fact of abiogenic origin. So he makes a good case for that. Is there really contrary evidence to what he presents? So he presents a number of fascinating things. There are actually a fair number of major oil and natural gas discoveries in non-sedimentary rock. In other words, no one would have expected them to have oil and natural gas, but they do. That's been known for a long time. There are a lot of those in the former Soviet Union because they don't actually, many people in the former Soviet Union don't believe the fossil fuel theory. But there are ones in the West as well. And so the point of this is that there is actually a lot of evidence for it, but the question you might ask is, well, is there contrary evidence? And yeah, in his book, Gold concedes that lignite, which is a type of coal, is almost certainly formed from naturally compressing peat, which is actually plants. This is not bacteria, and lignite is mined all over the place, and there's a lot of evidence. And keep in mind, Gold is very gung-ho his own theory. There's a lot of evidence that lignite in particular is actually produced by a biological process that is actually basically plants, not bacteria, that have been pressure cooked. It's worth noting it's one of the few examples where the evidence supports that the coal, if you will, is coming from plants or animals. The vast majority of oil fields that we've gone down into actually don't have plant material. They don't have plant chemicals from the membranes, from the constituents of plants. What they do have are chemicals called hoponides and some other chemicals that are characteristic of bacteria, which was a surprise, but it's now the mainstream theory that most of the oil and natural gas on Earth is coming from bacteria that were trapped in sedimentary rocks over time. That, in a nutshell, is the abiogenic theory of the origin of oil and natural gas. And if you want to find out a lot more about it, probably there are a lot of online sources and so on, but you probably should go to Deep Hot Biosphere, get a copy of it, or check it out if you're a library, if you have access to a good library. But there's a lot of work that's been done on this theory, and I can't do justice to it in a short video. This video was produced on Monday, June 24th, 2019.